The condensation was the culprit. A single, glistening bead of water that detached from the side of a crystal glass and splattered onto the polished mahogany of the table. It was no bigger than a teardrop, but in the hushed, sanctimonious air of the gilded cage, it was a bomb going off. Clara Mendoza, 24 years old and suffocating under a mountain of debt from a degree that had proven utterly useless, felt her world contract to the size of that single droplet. Her breath hitched. Her hand, still holding the chilled water pitcher, trembled almost imperceptibly. Across the table, Arthur Sterling, the titan of industry whose net worth was discussed in the same tones reserved for the GDP of small nations, stopped talking. He had been in the middle of a sentence, a low, guttural instruction to the man beside him. The silence he left in his wake was more terrifying than any shout. Slowly, deliberately, he turned his head. His eyes, the color of a stormy sea, didn't find Clara's. They locked onto the minuscule imperfection on his table. He stared at it. 1 second. 2. It was as if he were watching a venomous insect crawl across his billion-dollar contract. Then his gaze lifted, and it was like being pinned by a glacier. It wasn't anger. It was a cold, pure, ontological contempt. The kind of look one gives to a malfunctioning appliance, not a human being. "Finch!" he boomed, his voice a blade that sliced through the restaurant's expensive tranquility. Clara's stomach plummeted. Gregory Finch, the restaurant's general manager, a man who seemed to be constructed entirely of nervous sweat and ambition, materialized from the shadows as if summoned by a dark incantation. His face, usually a mask of oily sycophancy, was pale with panic. "Mr. Sterling, sir. Is everything to your satisfaction?" Finch's voice was a high-pitched squeak. Sterling didn't look at him. His Arctic gaze remained fixed on Clara. "This employee," he said, the word employee dripping with a disdain that suggested it was a synonym for vermin, "is incompetent. I am attempting to conduct a business meeting that will affect the global energy market, and I am forced to endure this sloppiness. Sir, my deepest apologies," Clara began, her voice a fragile whisper. "It was just a—" "Quiet," Finch hissed, his eyes wide with a primal fear. He whipped a silk handkerchief from his breast pocket and lunged toward the table. He didn't wipe the drop. He dabbed at it, with the reverence of a priest handling a holy relic, as if the water might permanently stain the very fabric of reality. "I am so sorry, Mr. Sterling. Profoundly," Finch babbled, bowing slightly. "It will not happen again. I will have her removed from your service at once." Sterling leaned back, a cruel smirk playing on his lips. He finally looked Clara up and down, taking in her simple black uniform, her dark hair pulled into a tight, severe bun, her face flushed with a humiliation so profound it was almost a physical pain. He then turned to his associate, a weary-looking older man named David Chen, and then Arthur Sterling began to speak in a language he was certain was nothing more than exotic noise to the serving girl before him. He spoke in a fluid, biting Lebanese Arabic, a dialect known for its sharp, poetic insults. "Hathihi hiya mushkilat, hada al-balad," he began, his voice laced with venom. "This is the problem with this country. They let children with empty heads do the work of professionals. Look at her. She can't even pour water without making a mess. I'd be surprised if she can even spell her own name." He glanced at Chen, expecting a shared laugh of superiority. Chen, to his credit, merely shifted uncomfortably in his seat, his eyes downcast. Sterling's gaze flickered back to Clara, who stood frozen, a statue of mortification. He added one last, dismissive barb, a final twist of the knife. "Fakat abidiha an wajhi, la urid أن أرى وجهها الغابي مرة أخرى. Just get her away from my face. I don't want to see her stupid face again. Finch, hearing the foreign tongue, simply plastered on a nervous, idiotic grin, assuming it was some vital part of their international business. Right away, sir, he chirped. Mendoza, you're finished. My office. Now. He turned to lead the way, expecting her to scurry after him like a chastised dog. But Clara didn't move. Something inside her, a cord that had been stretched taut by years of quiet desperation, by the crushing weight of her mother's medical bills, by the bitter irony of her life, finally snapped. It wasn't just the insult. It was the specific language he had chosen. It was the voice of her grandmother, her teta, who had spent countless evenings in their tiny, cramped apartment, teaching her the intricate poetry and fiery proverbs of her homeland. That $80,000 of debt wasn't from some useless liberal arts degree. It was from a master's in Near Eastern languages and civilizations. Her thesis, a celebrated analysis of the very dialectical nuances Sterling was now using to flay her. The fear that had been a cold stone in her gut vanished, replaced by a crystalline, righteous fury. She did not address Finch. She spoke directly to Arthur Sterling. Her voice, when it came, was not loud. It was perfectly modulated, calm, and carried the unaccented, academic precision of her late grandmother. She spoke in the same rich, evocative Lebanese Arabic. Atakiruk Saidi, Gair Sahih, she said. Your assumption, sir, is incorrect. The effect was instantaneous and absolute. The world stopped. Finch froze with his hand on the doorknob. David Chen's head shot up, his mouth falling open. Arthur Sterling, who was reaching for a pen, stopped mid-motion. His entire body went rigid, as if he'd been struck by lightning. Clara continued, her voice gaining a quiet strength, the cutting authority of an expert correcting a novice. أنا لست فارغة الرأس وفي الواقع أستطيع أن أقرأ أستطيع قراءة التقارير الماليات على طاولتك أستطيع قراءة شير فيروز وبالتأكيد أستطيع قراءة شخصياتك التي كشفتها للتو للجميع. I am not empty-headed, and in fact, I can read. I can read the financial reports on your table. I can read the poetry of Fairuz, and I can most certainly read your character, which you have just laid bare for everyone to see. Slowly, as if moving through deep water, Arthur Sterling turned his head to face her. The colour had drained from his face. The arrogance, the power, the sheer intimidating force of his presence, it all evaporated, replaced by a look of pure, unadulterated shock. He stared at her, as if she had just sprouted wings and breathed fire. "Mendoza! What in God's name are you doing?" Finch finally shrieked, spinning around, his face a blotchy purple. "Stop speaking that gibberish. You're harassing the customer." Clara ignored him, her eyes locked with Sterling's. She held his stunned gaze and switched from the formal Arabic to the more colloquial, almost familial tone her grandmother had used, the dialect of their kitchen, of their shared secrets. "Fork Dalek," she said, her accent flawless. "My competence is not defined by a single drop of water, just as a man's worth should not be defined by the size of his bank account. But you, sir, are making that a very difficult argument to defend." David Chen let out a small, strangled gasp. Arthur Sterling was utterly, completely speechless. This waitress, this piece of furniture, this nothing, had not only understood his private, venomous insult, but she had dismantled it, corrected it, and thrown it back in his face. She hadn't just spoken his language, she had spoken it with a level of nuanced, intellectual authority that his own expensive corporate tutors had never achieved. "What is happening here?" Finch screamed, finally finding his footing and striding back toward the table. Are you threatening him, Mendoza? I'll have you arrested." Clara finally broke her gaze from Sterling and turned to her pathetic manager. She switched back to perfect, unaccented English, her voice now cool and steady. "Mr. Finch, this gentleman referred to me as an empty-headed child. He said I was clumsy and stupid and couldn't read. He did so in Arabic, assuming I was too ignorant to understand." Finch's eyes darted frantically between Clara's resolute face and Sterling's shocked, pale one. "Mr. Sterling, I'm sure there's been a misunderstanding. She's being hysterical." "She's not being hysterical." The voice was Arthur Sterling's. It was quiet, strained, and utterly devoid of its earlier power. He was still staring at Clara, but he wasn't looking at a waitress anymore. He was seeing her. The raw shock was slowly being replaced by something else, a dawning, complex calculation. "She is not mistaken," he repeated in English, his voice flat. Finch's world audibly cracked. He looked at Clara with a new expression of pure horror. You speak that?" "I have a master's degree in it," Clara said simply. You're fired," Finch finally sputtered, his composure shattering completely. He pointed a trembling finger at the door. "Fired. Insubordination. Eavesdropping on a private conversation. Get out. Get out of my restaurant now. Clear out your locker." Clara looked at Finch's trembling finger. Then she looked at Sterling. He was just watching her, his expression now completely unreadable. He didn't defend her. He didn't stop Finch. He just watched, his mind clearly racing behind those stormy eyes. A bitter, ironic laugh almost escaped her. Of course. What had she expected? A sudden change of heart? An apology? He was a billionaire, and she was the help who had just profoundly embarrassed him in front of his associate. "Fine," Clara said. She reached behind her back and untied the strings of the black apron, the symbol of her servitude, of her failed ambitions. She folded it into a neat, crisp square and placed it on the edge of the table. "I'll expect my final paycheck in the mail," she said to Finch, her voice clear and devoid of emotion. She then looked directly at Arthur Sterling one last time. "Have a pleasant evening, Mr. Sterling," she said in English. Then she leaned in just enough for only him and David Chen to hear and whispered in Arabic, her voice a silken threat. "Wa bitawfiq fi safkatik, satataj ilayha." "And good luck with your deal. You're going to need it." Without another word, she turned and walked out of the room. She didn't run. She didn't slam the door. She closed it gently behind her, leaving Arthur Sterling sitting in the silent, smouldering wreckage of his own arrogance. The cold Chicago wind that whipped off Lake Michigan felt like a slap in the face, a brutal return to reality. One moment of glorious, defiant rebellion in a warm, gilded room, and now this. Unemployed, rent due in 5 days, her mother's prescription, copay, a staggering $300 due tomorrow. She had exactly $287.42 in her checking account. The righteous fire that had burned in her chest now felt like a pile of cold, stupid ash. What had it gotten her? She'd proven a point to a man who would forget her existence by the time his dessert arrived. She'd let her pride, her Teta's pride, write a check her life couldn't cash. She went home to her tiny basement apartment in Logan Square, where the world was a parade of passing feet seen through a grime-streaked window. She sat on the lumpy, second-hand couch that smelled of other people's lives, and did what she hadn't allowed herself to do in months. She wept. She cried for her wasted education, for her mother's failing health, for the sheer, grinding unfairness of a world where a man could be worth billions, and still be so utterly bankrupt as a human being. The next day was a grey fog of online applications and automated rejections. Barista, receptionist, dog walker, data entry clerk. Each click of the mouse felt like another shovelful of dirt on the grave of her ambitions. She sent her meticulously crafted resume to 4 different translation agencies, highlighting her master's degree and thesis. 2 sent back automated emails within the hour. Thank you for your interest, but the position requires a minimum of 5 years of in-field corporate experience. Her academic brilliance was, it seemed, a form of currency no one accepted. At 4:15 p.m., her phone buzzed, an unknown number with a downtown area code, probably a debt collector. She let it go to voicemail. It buzzed again immediately, a message. With a sigh of resignation, she listened. A message for Ms. Clara Mendoza. A crisp, professional female voice stated, "My name is Eleanor Vance, Executive Assistant to Mr. Arthur Sterling. Mr. Sterling requests your presence at his offices at your earliest convenience. A car has been dispatched to your address and will arrive in 20 minutes. Please be ready." The message ended. Clara's heart began to hammer against her ribs like a trapped bird. A car? A meeting? This was worse than she thought. He wasn't just going to forget her. He was going to actively destroy her. Sue her for harassment? Blacklist her from every service job in the city? Her mind spun with terrifying possibilities. But what choice did she have? Ignoring him would only make it worse. 20 minutes. She splashed her face with icy water, the shock of it clearing her head slightly. She pulled on her only interview outfit, a pair of simple black slacks and a worn but clean white blouse, and scraped her hair back. She felt like a condemned prisoner being summoned to hear her sentence. Exactly 20 minutes later, a silent, obsidian black town car, so clean it seemed to absorb the light around it, glided to a stop in front of her building. The driver, a stoic man in a dark suit, opened the rear door for her without a word. The interior smelled of rich leather and quiet power. As the car pulled away from the curb, Clara felt as if she were crossing a border into another country, leaving her old, broken life behind. She had no idea she was being driven toward the battlefield where her new one would be forged. The car descended into a private underground garage beneath a skyscraper of black glass and steel that clawed at the sky. Sterling Industries. The driver led her to a private elevator. He swiped a keycard, and the elevator ascended with a silent, stomach-lurching speed. The doors opened not into a lobby, but directly into a cavernous penthouse office. The view was staggering, a panoramic vista of the city and the vast, steel-grey expanse of Lake Michigan. The office was brutally minimalist, furnished with sharp angles and cold surfaces, and standing before the floor-to-ceiling window, his back to her, was Arthur Sterling. He was in his shirt sleeves, the jacket of his $1,000 suit discarded. He looked as if he hadn't slept. "Eleanor, you can go. Hold all my calls," he said, his voice low and gravelly. The assistant, a woman who looked as severe and efficient as the office itself, gave a single nod and vanished through a side door. The elevator doors slid shut behind Clara, sealing her in. The silence was thick with tension. Finally, he turned. The cold contempt from the restaurant was gone. In its place was a look of intense, unsettling scrutiny. It was the look of a scientist examining a strange and unpredictable new element. "Georgetown University," he stated. It was not a question. "Yes," Clara said, her voice barely a whisper, but it didn't waver. "My father was a major donor," he said, walking slowly towards her, circling like a shark. "He always said their liberal arts programs were a waste of good money. a place for the children of the wealthy to learn how to feel superior about being useless. He stopped a few feet from her. Last night, your accent, it wasn't textbook. It was authentic, lived in. My grandmother was from Bachara, Clara said, finding her footing. She taught me. My thesis was on the preservation of poetic traditions in the Kadisha Valley. He absorbed this, a flicker of something. Surprise? Respect? In his eyes. You have a master's degree in poetry, and you were serving me sea bass. He said it to himself, a man trying to solve an impossible puzzle. My mother has multiple sclerosis, Mr. Sterling. The medical bills don't care about poetry. The raw honesty of her statement seemed to land a blow. He was silent for a long moment. What I said in the restaurant was inexcusable, he said, the words sounding foreign and stiff on his tongue. I was under immense pressure. It is not an excuse, but it is the reason. I apologize. Thank you, Clara said quietly. I didn't bring you here for an apology, he said, his tone shifting, becoming sharp and focused. I brought you here because I have a problem. A very large, very expensive problem. He gestured to a massive conference table where the same documents from the restaurant were spread out, along with dozens more. This is a $2 billion joint venture, he said, his voice dropping. A desalination project in the UAE. My partners are a consortium led by Sheikh Rashid Al Hamad. The deal is on the verge of collapse. He picked up a tablet and swiped through a series of emails. My lead translator, a man I've used for a decade, had a stroke 2 weeks ago. I've been using a top-tier translation service, and it's been a catastrophe. We are talking past each other. Every communication is a new insult. They think I'm being aggressive and disrespectful. I think they're being evasive and unreliable. His eyes locked on hers. Last night, you didn't just understand the words I said. You understood the intent, the subtext, the culture embedded within the language. You knew exactly how to respond. You knew how to wound. He put down the tablet and looked at her with a new, unnerving intensity. I am surrounded by people who tell me what they think I want to hear. My lawyers see legal clauses. My financiers see numbers. No one sees the people. And right now, the people are the problem. He paused, the air crackling with unspoken possibilities. My rival, Marcus Thorne, is circling this deal like a vulture. He knows I'm struggling. I suspect he's actively trying to sabotage it. The Sheikh is old school. He values honor and face above all else. One more misunderstanding, and he'll walk straight into Thorne's arms. Clara's mind was racing. This was not what she had expected. What are you proposing? She asked, her voice steady. This is not a job offer, he said bluntly. It's a test, a trial by fire. He pointed to a single bound document on the table. This is the Sheikh's latest missive. My current translators say it's a list of vague, poetic complaints. They've advised me to respond with a firm legal counteroffer. I have a feeling they're wrong. I'm giving you 2 hours, in the office next door. I want to know what it really says. Not just the words. Tell me what he's feeling. Tell me what he wants. Tell me what I'm missing. He looked at her, his expression a mixture of desperation and deep-seated skepticism. 2 hours. If you give me the same useless garbage I've been getting, my driver will take you home, and I'll have a check for $10,000 sent to you for your trouble and for the incident. But if you show me something real, we'll talk. Clara sat in a sterile, glass-walled office, the document cold in her hands. It wasn't a contract. It wasn't a list of demands. It was, just as the other translators had said, deeply poetic. It spoke of old falcons who no longer trust the falconer's glove, of desert wells that have been poisoned by careless hands. A lesser translator would have seen metaphors. Clara saw a diagnosis. She read it once, twice, a third time. She closed her eyes, and she could hear her Tater's voice, explaining how, in their culture, business was a conversation between families, not corporations. Trust was the only real currency. The sheikh wasn't complaining. He was grieving the death of a relationship. The poison wasn't a specific, contractual clause. It was the cold, impersonal, brutally efficient language Sterling's American lawyers had been using. They had been sending legal threats to a man who wanted to be spoken to like a brother. The falcon wasn't the deal. It was the sheikh's honor, and Sterling's team had, with their cultural ignorance, repeatedly wounded it. She didn't just translate the document. She annotated it. Line by line, she explained the cultural subtext, the historical allusions, the warnings hidden within the poetry. She cross-referenced specific phrases with traditional Bedouin proverbs. She didn't just deliver a translation, she delivered a roadmap into the sheikh's mind. 1 hour and 47 minutes later, she walked back into Arthur Sterling's office and placed her analysis on his desk. He read it in silence. He didn't skim. He read every word, his expression growing more and more grim. When he finished, he looked up at her, and the last vestiges of his skepticism were gone, replaced by a raw, stunned respect. "All this time," he said, his voice a low growl of self-recrimination, "I've been sending cannons to a poetry recital." He stood up and walked to the window. "They feel I've dishonored them. They think I see them as primitive." "They think you see them the way you saw me," Clara said quietly. He turned from the window, and his eyes met hers. There was no apology this time, but something deeper, an acknowledgement, a shared understanding. "The negotiations are moving to Dubai in 3 days," he said, his voice all business again. "I'm not offering you a job, Ms. Mendoza. I'm offering you a contract, $100,000 for 1 week of your time. You will be my sole linguistic and cultural advisor. You will sit in every meeting. You will have final say on all communications. Eleanor will arrange for a wardrobe, travel, everything. If we save this deal, a bonus of $1 million. If we fail, you keep the 100,000, and we part ways." Clara thought of her mother's face, etched with worry. She thought of the mountain of bills on her kitchen table. She thought of the fire in her belly from that night in the restaurant. This was more than money. It was a chance to prove that everything she had ever learned, everything her grandmother had ever taught her, was not useless. It was a weapon. "I have one condition," she said, her voice ringing with a newfound confidence. Sterling raised an eyebrow. "In those rooms I am not your employee. I am your partner. My counsel on matters of language and culture is not a suggestion, it is a directive. Is that understood?" A slow, genuine smile spread across Arthur Sterling's face. It transformed him. "Ms. Mendoza," he said, "for a chance to save $2 billion, you can call yourself the Queen of Sheba. Welcome aboard." The boardroom in Dubai was designed to intimidate. A vast, circular chamber of gleaming marble and glass, it overlooked the impossible skyline of the city on one side and the endless, serene desert on the other. On one side of the massive table sat Arthur Sterling, David Chen, and Clara. On the other sat Sheikh Rashid Al-Hamad, a man with eyes that held the wisdom of the desert, flanked by his 3 sons and a retinue of advisors. At the sheikh's right hand sat a man introduced as Mr. Fayed, their lead translator and advisor. He was European educated, impeccably dressed, with a smile that was both charming and predatory. Clara felt a prickle of unease the moment she saw him. The mood was frigid. The sheikh had not yet smiled. Following Clara's explicit instructions, the meeting did not begin with business. It began with an apology. Not a weak one, but a strong one. Clara, speaking in flawless, formal Arabic, delivered it on Sterling's behalf. She spoke of their inexcusable cultural illiteracy, of their grief at having inadvertently caused offense, and of their deep desire to rebuild the bridge of trust between two families. The temperature in the room shifted. The ice did not melt, but it began to crack. For 2 days, Clara was a maestro. She was a shield and a sword. When Sterling's lawyers would draft a clause that was legally sound but culturally abrasive, she would rewrite it, softening the language without altering the legal meaning. When the sheikh's sons would make a statement that sounded non-committal, she would explain the subtext of honor and obligation that lay beneath. She taught Sterling when to be silent, when to drink the tea, how to accept a compliment. She was building the bridge, stone by painstaking stone. They were close. The final sticking point was a complex liability clause related to potential government delays. The sheikh was hesitant. The room grew tense again. Finally, the sheikh held up a hand and began a rapid, low-toned discussion in Arabic with his sons and Mr. Fayed. Clara and the American team sat in respectful silence. The sheikh was agitated. "This is a risk my father's father would not have taken," one son argued. Then Fayed, the translator, leaned in and whispered something to the sheikh. Clara caught only a few words, but her blood ran cold. A small concession, a guarantee of partnership, Al-Jamil Construction. The sheikh listened, then nodded slowly. "Fine. Propose it." Mr. Fayed turned back to the Americans, his face a mask of professional sincerity. He began to speak in English. "Gentlemen, Ms. Mendoza, His Excellency is prepared to make a great concession. He will agree to your liability clause as written." A wave of relief washed over David Chen. Sterling remained impassive, watching Clara. "There is but one small condition," Fayed continued smoothly. "As a gesture of our new partnership, he asks that for the initial phase of construction, you agree to use a preferred local partner, Al-Jamil Construction, for material sourcing. It is a symbolic gesture to show the people of Dubai that this is a true partnership." It sounded reasonable, almost trivial. David Chen was already nodding. Sterling glanced at Clara. Her face was ashen. Her hands were clenched into fists under the table. "Ms. Mendoza?" Sterling asked, his voice carefully neutral. "Is this acceptable?" This was it, the precipice. "Mr. Sterling," she said, her voice low but steady, "may I request a brief recess to confer with you and Mr. Chen privately?" Fayed's smile tightened almost imperceptibly. The sheikh's sons looked annoyed at the interruption. "It is a matter of the utmost urgency," Clara added, her eyes boring into Sterling's. Honoring his promise, Sterling stood immediately. "5 minutes, Your Excellency. Please, excuse us." The moment the door of the antechamber closed, Sterling's composure broke. "What is it? What did you hear?" "We're not being asked for a partnership," Clara said, her voice shaking with a mixture of the silence inside the Gulf Stream was a physical entity, a pressure in the ears that hummed at the edge of hearing. Below them, the Black Sea was a sheet of wrinkled ink under a canopy of stars so dense and brilliant they seemed to mock the distant, smudged lights of human cities. Clara sat in a cream leather seat that was worth more than her car, her borrowed suit feeling like a costume she was desperate to shed. The adrenaline that had coursed through her for 3 days, a high-wire act of linguistic and psychological warfare, had finally receded, leaving behind an exhaustion so profound it felt bone deep. She watched the reflection of her own face in the polished sapphire of the window, a pale, drawn ghost suspended between the earth and the heavens. Across the cabin, Arthur Sterling held a crystal tumbler of Macallan, the amber liquid catching the low light. He wasn't drinking it. He was merely observing it, his gaze distant, his usual kinetic energy coiled into a stillness that was no longer predatory, but contemplative. The architect of a global empire, a man who moved markets with a single word, had spent the better part of an hour in utter silence, lost in the view of the curving earth. Finally he spoke, his voice a low rumble that didn't so much break the silence as become a part of it. "Professor Al-Masri," he said, turning the glass in his hand, "of Georgetown. The Trojan clause. Did he specialize in corporate law or classical literature?" Clara's heart gave a single, hard thump against her ribs. She had been waiting for this. She turned from her reflection to face him, her expression unreadable. "Neither," she said, her voice steady. His field was theoretical linguistics, and he never existed. Sterling's lips quirked, not quite a smile, but an acknowledgement. "I assumed as much. My legal team has been frantically searching university databases for the last 90 minutes. They're convinced he's a ghost." He finally took a sip of the scotch, his eyes never leaving hers. "It was a masterful gambit. You didn't just expose him. You annihilated his credibility with a construct of pure intellect. You built a prison out of words and locked him inside it." She gave a slight, weary shrug. "He used language as a weapon. I simply turned it back on him. It was the only way. A direct accusation would have been my word against his. It would have forced the sheikh to choose a side, and in doing so, to lose face. This way, Fayed was discredited by an academic authority that couldn't be questioned because it wasn't real. And the sheikh, Sterling mused, was allowed to discover the treachery himself. You preserved his honor. He leaned forward, placing the glass on the polished burl wood table between them. The intensity returned to his gaze, but it was different now. The cold, assessing quality was gone, replaced by a raw, searching curiosity. When you walked back into that room after our recess, you knew. You knew exactly what you were going to do. I saw it on your face. You weren't afraid. The statement hung in the air, an invitation. And for the first time, Clara felt the urge to be completely, brutally honest with him. "That's not true," she said softly. "I've never been more terrified in my entire life. My hands were shaking so badly under the table, I had to clench them into fists to stop them. My heart felt like it was going to beat its way out of my chest." She looked down at her own hands, half expecting them to still be trembling. "I wasn't afraid of Fayed, or of losing the deal. I was afraid of you." He recoiled slightly, the observation clearly landing like a physical blow. "Of me?" "Yes," she affirmed, meeting his gaze without flinching. "Because I had to trust you. Completely. I had to trust that the man who called me an empty-headed, stupid child just a few days ago would have the discipline and the foresight to follow the lead of that same child without question. I had to bet everything, my life, really, on the hope that you were a better man than you had shown yourself to be. That was the real gamble." The cabin fell silent again, but this time it was charged, electric. Sterling stared at her, and she could see a war of emotions playing out behind his stormy eyes. Shock, shame, and a dawning, painful understanding. He had seen the situation as a strategic problem to be solved. She was showing him the human equation he had completely ignored, the terrifying leap of faith she had been forced to make in him. He broke eye contact first, looking back out the window at the dark world below. "My father," he said, his voice strained, "built this company from nothing. He was a brilliant, ruthless man. He believed emotion was a liability, weakness. He used to say, 'The moment you start seeing people instead of assets and liabilities, you've already lost.' I spent my whole life trying to live up to that. To be that." He let out a short, bitter laugh. "In that restaurant, I was my father's son, and I was about to lose $2 billion because of it, because I saw a malfunctioning appliance, not a person, because I couldn't see the most valuable asset in the room." He turned back to her, his face stripped bare of its usual armor of command and control. He looked older, wearier. "You weren't just a better translator, Clara. You were a better strategist, a better leader. You saw the people. You saw the honor. You saw the trust. I saw a contract. My father was wrong." It was the most profound apology he could have offered. It was more than an apology. It was a confession, a tectonic shift in the foundation of his world. Clara felt something inside her unclench, a knot of resentment she hadn't even realized she was holding so tightly. "He wasn't entirely wrong," she conceded quietly. "You can't run a business this size on poetry and goodwill, but you can't run it without them, either. You need both. You need to understand the balance sheet and the human heart." He nodded slowly, absorbing her words. "The bridge," he murmured, echoing the Sheikh's term for her. "That's what you are." He reached into his jacket and pulled out a sleek, impossibly thin tablet, sliding it across the table to her. "Your bonus. $1 million. It's already been wired to your account. The password is Bichara." Clara stared at the device. The name of her grandmother's village. A small detail, but it spoke volumes. He hadn't just listened. He had heard. She picked up the tablet, her fingers tracing the cold glass. She didn't turn it on. The number it represented was too vast, too abstract to comprehend at 30,000 feet. It was a phantom, a myth. It wouldn't be real until she was on the ground. The money became real at 11:03 a.m. the next day in the sterile, fluorescent-lit lobby of her bank. She had walked there from her basement apartment, the crisp Chicago air feeling sharp and new in her lungs. She handed the teller her debit card and asked for her balance, her voice a dry whisper. The young woman tapped a few keys, her expression bored, then her eyes widened slightly. She looked up at Clara, then back at the screen, as if to confirm it wasn't a typo. "Your current checking account balance," the teller said, her voice hushed with awe, "is $1,287.42. Clara felt the world tilt on its axis. A wave of vertigo washed over her. It wasn't the explosive joy she had imagined. It was a profound, terrifying silence. The silence of a war that has suddenly ended. For her entire adult life, every single decision, what to eat, what to wear, whether she could afford to take the bus or had to walk, whether she could fill a prescription or had to split the pills, had been dictated by the relentless, grinding calculus of debt. Now, the enemy was gone. The war was over, and she didn't know who she was in peacetime. She walked out of the bank in a daze and sat on a cold stone bench. She took out her phone, her hands trembling. She logged into her student loan portal, a website she visited with dread every month. The number glared at her. 83,451. She navigated to the payment page, her heart hammering. She typed in the full amount, her finger hovering over the Submit Payment button. It felt like disarming a bomb that had been strapped to her for years. She pressed it. A green check mark appeared. Payment successful. Your current balance is 0.00. And then the tears came. Not tears of joy, but of catharsis. A flood of grief for the years she had lost to worry, for the opportunities she had missed, for the constant, low-grade fear that had been her constant companion. She wept for the girl who had studied ancient poetry under a single bare bulb, dreaming of a world that seemed determined to crush her. She cried until she was empty, until there was nothing left but the cool autumn air and the quiet, unbelievable reality of being free. Her next stop was a sprawling, sun-drenched facility of glass and gardens on the North Shore, a place that smelled of cedar and clean linen, not antiseptic and despair. Her mother was waiting in the common room, her frail body bundled in a worn cardigan, her face etched with the familiar lines of worry. "Clara, honey, you look exhausted. Is everything okay? Did you keep the job?" Clara knelt before her mother's wheelchair, taking her thin, cool hands in her own. "Everything is more than okay, Mum." She explained it all, the deal, the bonus, the impossible number that was now theirs. Her mother listened, her expression shifting from confusion to disbelief, to a dawning, radiant joy that made her look 10 years younger. "But a place like this," her mother whispered, looking around at the elegant, peaceful surroundings. "Clara, we can't." "I've already paid the deposit," Clara said, her voice thick with emotion. "For the best suite they have, with the private garden. You can have your roses again, Mum, and the physical therapy program starts tomorrow. The best doctors, the best care. No more worrying, no more counting pills. No more." Her mother's eyes filled with tears, and she pulled Clara into a fierce, trembling hug. "My Teta," she sobbed into her daughter's hair, using her own mother's name for her. "She would be so proud. All that knowledge she gave you. You turned her stories into a miracle." That night, for the last time, Clara slept in her basement apartment. The sounds of the city, the rumble of the L train, the parade of feet past her window, were the sounds of a life that was no longer hers. She lay awake for hours, not in anxiety but in quiet contemplation. She had the money. Her mother was safe. She was free. She could disappear. She could move to a quiet cottage by the sea and spend the rest of her life translating poetry, finally living the life she had dreamed of. She never had to see Arthur Sterling again. The thought was a powerful temptation, a peaceful, anonymous existence. But as she drifted off to sleep, she remembered the look in Sterling's eyes on the plane. The look of a man who had just realized the map he'd been using his entire life was wrong. And she knew, with a certainty that settled deep in her soul, that their story wasn't over. A week later, she walked into the penthouse office of Sterling Industries. The city spread out below the window, a kingdom of glass and steel. This time she felt no intimidation. She was not here as a supplicant or an employee. She was here as a sovereign power. She wore a simple, elegant navy dress she had bought herself, and her hair was down, falling in soft waves around her shoulders. Arthur was standing by the window, but he turned as she entered. He looked different. The restless energy was still there, but it was channeled, focused. He looked like a man with a new purpose. "Clara," he said, and there was a genuine warmth in his voice. "Thank you for coming." "You said you had a proposal," she replied, her tone calm and professional. "I do." He gestured not to the imposing conference table, but to 2 comfortable armchairs near the window. A small table between them held a silver tray with a porcelain teapot and 2 cups, a gesture of hospitality, of equality. He didn't offer her a job. He didn't talk about salary or benefits. He began to talk about the world, about the mistakes he had made, the deals that had soured, the partnerships that had failed because of the cultural blindness he now saw was endemic to his entire organization. He spoke of his company not as a machine for making money, but as a global entity with a clumsy, destructive footprint. "I've spent my life building things, Clara," he said, his passion evident. "Power plants, refineries, infrastructure. But I've been building them on foundations of sand because I never understood the ground I was building on. Dubai wasn't an anomaly. It was a diagnosis of a rot that goes right to the core of this company. Of me." He leaned forward, his eyes locking onto hers. "I don't need another translator. I have 100 of them. I need a new perspective. I need a new conscience for this company. I am creating a new, independent division, the Sterling Group for Global Strategy and Cultural Integration. It won't be a subsidiary. It will be a partner organization with veto power over every international negotiation we undertake. It will be our diplomatic corps, our intelligence agency, and our moral compass. I don't want you to run it." He paused, letting the words hang in the air. "I want you to build it, from the ground up, as my full partner." Clara stared at him, the scope of his offer settling over her. This was not a job. It was a throne, a chance to wield immense power, to reshape the way a corporate titan interacted with the world. The quiet life of a scholar vanished from her mind, replaced by this staggering, terrifying new possibility. "Why me?" she asked, the question genuine. "You could hire a dozen former ambassadors, PhDs from every Ivy League school." "Because they've already learned how to play the game," he said instantly. "They would tell me how to navigate the world as it is. You showed me how to see it as it should be. They have experience. You have wisdom. They have knowledge. You have understanding. And," he added, a wry smile touching his lips, "because you are the only person I've ever met who has the courage to tell me I'm being a damn fool, and the intellectual firepower to prove it. I don't need more people to agree with me, Clara. I need someone to make me better." She considered his words, her mind racing. She thought of the humiliation in the restaurant, the cold contempt in his eyes. The scar was still there. But she also thought of his confession on the plane, of the password, Bachare, of this very moment. He wasn't trying to buy her silence or her skills. He was trying to atone, not with money, but with action, by changing the very DNA of his empire. This was how she could ensure that what happened to her would never happen to anyone else. This was how she could honor her Teta's legacy on a global scale. She stood up, her decision made. She felt a profound sense of calm, of rightness. She walked to the window and looked down at the sprawling city, at the millions of lives intersecting, colliding, and misunderstanding one another. "I accept," she said, her voice ringing with quiet authority, "with 2 conditions." Sterling rose and stood beside her, a genuine smile spreading across his face. "I expected nothing less. First," she said, turning to him, "the division will not bear your name. It will not be an extension of your brand. It must be seen as objective, as a bridge, not a battering ram. We will call it the Kadisha Group, after the valley where my grandmother was born, a place of sanctuary and understanding." He nodded without hesitation. "Done. It's better. Second," she continued, her voice firm, her gaze unwavering, "the Kadisha Group will be endowed with a perpetual, non-revocable fund. 10% of its annual operating budget will be dedicated to funding scholarships globally for students of linguistics, anthropology, and the humanities. We'll call it the Teta Mendoza Grant. Its mission will be to find the others, the brilliant minds with poets' hearts, the ones who see the world differently. We will ensure they never have to choose between their passion and their survival. We will give them the power to build their own bridges." Arthur Sterling looked at her, and the awe he'd shown on the plane was back, deeper now, tempered with a profound respect. He saw not the waitress, not the translator, but the visionary she had become. He was not just offering her a partnership, he was ceding a part of his soul, his legacy, to her care. He extended his hand. "Clara Mendoza," he said, his voice filled with a sincerity she never would have thought possible. "It will be an honor to be your partner." She took his hand. His grip was firm, solid. It was not the end of a story. It was the signing of a treaty, a pact between two worlds, made in a glass tower in the sky, to go down and change the one below.